Naval drones would have struck Russian Sukhois. It's a historic moment, says Budanov. And then the Ukrainian intelligence says, for the first time in the world, our warriors have destroyed an enemy fighter plane thanks to a naval drone. Magura? The fighter plane of the Russian aggressor state caught fire in the air and finally crashed into the sea at the bottom of Neptune's ruthless domain. How did this happen? Xavier Stelman.
The Ukrainians had already managed to destroy a helicopter at the end of the year in the first instance. 2024, by equipping their famous small naval drones. Originally, they were big jet skis, but they gradually perfected them by first installing Soviet anti-aircraft missiles. Russian helicopters, flying low, are targeting and attempting to shoot down small naval drones. We can easily imagine these helicopters getting quite close. But here, we are rather on a category even above. We are on Russian fighter planes. The Sukhoi 30 plane costs 50 million euros, far more expensive than a helicopter.
You have a debris there with you, is that it?
I have debris from a Sukhoi Su-34 aircraft. You should know that the Russians have lost 150 planes of all categories in Ukraine today. Ukrainians recover these pieces and offer some of them. I am the repossessor of a piece of Sukhoi 34 shot down at the very beginning of the war in the Battle of Kiev. The other parts are sold, and the money is primarily used for humanitarian work. In the end, having planes shot down is not a novelty. The significant innovation is that we're not dealing with a heavy ground system, RR system, or a plane that would have been shot down on the ground. It's a naval drone that they have adapted with infrared-guided anti-aircraft missiles. Crucially, the Russian aircraft system cannot defend against a comparatively rudimentary system.
Capable of detecting it, however, or not.
In principle, they can detect Russian planes and their departures. All planes worldwide have detectors with various capabilities. They see a kind of bright flash. And so, logically, they must emit kinds of hot balls that are hotter than their own engine, and these hot balls must attract the missile. It didn't work. Good for the Ukrainians. They announced they shot down 2 Sukhoi 34s last night. There's only one that has been revealed by the image, proven by the image, but maybe there would be 2.
We're talking about a specific drone here, the Magura.
V5.
How are these drones produced?
So, originally they are produced very simply. It's just that they are simply kinds of jet skis that have been adapted and really perfected little by little. First, we see it here. The goal was to introduce on top this camera ball that we see here, an infrared ball and the 2 plates that are horizontal. There is the one at the front, I believe. It's a global positioning system sensor, Starlink communication sensor, sorry. We can continue to control it remotely from KIF calmly. They are capable of taking these drones, which have an ever-increasing range, to the other end of the Black Sea. The Battle of the Black Sea was won by these drones. Gradually, the missions grew increasingly complex. That is to say, you have easy kamikaze drones, but now you have kamikaze drones that are protected by air defense drones that shoot down these fighter planes. And you also have drones that will open themselves, these naval drones, and launch small first-person view kamikaze drones to conduct ground strikes.
We even learned that the Taiwanese are inspired by this model to repel a potential Chinese invasion. Are the Taiwanese closely watching what's happening in Ukraine? Have you ever witnessed contact between the Taiwanese and the Ukrainians?
No, I can't say that I've witnessed that, but it's clear that they say it because in their doctrine, they state it very clearly. How to have a relationship from the weak to the strong. How does a small navy, or even a non-existent navy, in the case of the Ukrainian Navy, manage to regain control of the Black Sea? And completely drive out the dominant fleet from the area? By destroying more than half of the tonnage of this fleet and forcing it to stay several hundred kilometers away. So that's a great victory, obviously, and all the countries in the world are inspired by it. Taiwan is the primary concern as they are the next target of imperialism, whether from Russia or China. The concept remains the same. Having cheap systems, easy to use, that can be launched by hundreds and hundreds and have a catastrophic effect for the enemy. Obviously, it's interesting for everyone. That's why France, last week, tested this naval drone for the first time, also on a barge, to validate the concept.
And the same situation also occurred on the side of Crimea. Xavier Stelman.
Our army also carried out a large operation.
Precision against
military targets in Crimea.
One more. A second Russian plane was shot down within a day. Military depots have also been destroyed, who are working to enable Ukraine's defense against the occupier. I thank everyone who develops and implements new technologies and capabilities for Ukraine.
Naval drones are also very present in the Black Sea. When I was in Crimea, the fishermen told me, also the Russian fishermen who told me, we see naval drones everywhere in the Black Sea. The Ukrainians are trying to remotely pilot these naval drones you were talking about. Why continue to persist around Crimea?
Crimea remains Ukrainian territory, and these operations are being conducted by Ukraine on its occupied land. So, in legal terms and in terms of objectives, it remains an area that they want to liberate. Even if militarily we suspect that it will still be out of reach, at least with the military support we offer them. So, it is legitimate to continue working on this area. The aerial drone bombings they have conducted there are noteworthy. In this context, it has been, for example, on the bases of Sukhoi, 2 Russian air bases that are on Crimea, and from which fighter planes take off to attack the entire area of Kherson and the entire area of Zaporizhzhia. Russian airports in the region have been heavily bombed, forcing the evacuation of some planes, including Sukhoi 35s, which are used for air defense. Some devices remain on the ground. If these planes must also leave, then you'll be forced to take off from much farther away, across the Sea of Azov. And your flight, which was only 150 kilometers, to do bombing you are now forced to do 300, 400 km. That is to say, you are forced to do half as many missions in a day. And so logically, the more they manage to push back the Russians from Crimea, the less they themselves will suffer from bombings by the Russian Air Force.
Also hitting Donbass is one of the top priorities at the moment, including strikes from the Ukrainian Air Force. These words from the Ukrainian General Staff indicate a successful military strike. It has been confirmed that the Air Force of the Ukrainian Armed Forces carried out a devastating strike on the command post of the enemy's 6th Motor Rifle Division in Barmut. Is Donbass still within reach of the Ukrainians?
Fights continue in the area, with Russians still absent from a third of the southern Donetsk Oblast in the Donbass region. So, at the current pace, it would take them more than 3 to 4 years to even hope to conquer just the Donbass. Given the difficulties and Russia's further slowed progress, we know it's unaffordable. Conditions have worsened since last year, with progress becoming even more challenging. The fighting persists. And moreover, the Ukrainians will be able to strike deep into strategic objectives, especially command posts, logistics centers, ammo, fuel, and vehicle depots. Indeed, all this less will allow the Russians to work properly. And here, what's interesting is that it's aviation, the Air Force. It wasn't a missile fired from 186 miles away. That means that Ukrainian planes can afford to approach a few tens of kilometers from the front for themselves, drop gliding bombs. 200, 500 kilos of explosives, including the French A2SM bombs, and which will be able to hit up to the area that is a little further north. Here, at the level of Bakhmut, what must not be forgotten, Bakhmut, it's a catch, a Pyrrhic victory. May 2023, if I recall correctly. 2 years later, they advanced 4.35 miles. Bakhmut remains fully accessible to Ukrainian aviation despite Russian efforts.
The Ukrainian army also wants to continue striking in Russian territory, and for the moment it denies any end of operation. In Kursk?
We also continue operating in the Kursk and Belgorod regions. Russia continues to reject a full and enduring ceasefire. All our partners are already
Tired. We
defend our positions and will act accordingly. In our front lines and actions on Russian territory, both on the front and in ours.
Yet the Russians are claiming victory at Kursk. Who is wrong, who is right in this story?
The Russians have regained 99% of the territory the Ukrainians had occupied since August. But ideologically, the fact that the Ukrainians continue to have a foothold on Russian soil, obviously, it's a great ideological victory. At first, no one believed the Ukrainians would resist until Trump's election. After 9 to 10 months of operation, the Russians have failed to remove the Ukrainians from this area, making it an ideological victory for Ukraine. The Russians claim the war is over, but as long as Ukrainians remain on Russian territory, it's clearly a Ukrainian victory. As long as the Russians are forced to concentrate resources and fight in this region, it means less available elsewhere. For example, to try to progress and destroy the Donbass.
However, Russia maintains that some of their troops mobilized in Kursk have returned to the Donbass.
Part has definitely returned as the area is significantly smaller than before. Logically, this 7-kilometer wide and 1-kilometer deep front can't accommodate 70,000 men. But that the Russians announce a victory that did not happen, it's not the first time. The city of Toretsk was announced as captured at the beginning of February. And today it is still 60% free, it is 100% destroyed, but only a small part of it is taken by Russia. There is always a distinction between what the Russians announce and the reality on the ground, as proven by images every day.
Speaking of disrupting Russian territory, the Ukrainians do not rule out disrupting the famous May 9th parade. Look at these words. Kiev cannot guarantee the safety of leaders visiting Moscow with all the security there is in Moscow around this parade. Can the Ukrainians, and I want to say want to, destabilize this May 9th parade? Is there really a goal in all of this?
It wouldn't be the first time already. If only for the fear of having a plane that would have been shot down during this parade. Russia had cancelled all air parades across the entire country on May 9th 2 years ago. Despite their claims of weather issues, it was clearly untrue. They are well aware that the Ukrainians can pass through. Simply a missile fired from the poles, like, for example, the Star Trek, which is with a laser guidance that the Russians can't actually prevent. These missiles have exceptionally high performance, and they will never be certain that there isn't in a basement, in a field, 50 kilometers to the east or west of Moscow, someone who could shoot at them. So there is this fear.
Why can't he do it with this famous device?
Because there is still a permeability at the borders. We know very well that the Ukrainians have managed to carry out operations on Russian soil by organizing, for example, targeted attacks on Russian generals who were killed in a way that was entirely effective and legitimate. So, we know very well that we can continue to have air defense systems, including Russian ones, that could have been diverted by some of the military who are opponents. So, there is always this ideology behind. But even if it's not true, it forces Russia to deploy a lot of resources that they have to withdraw from the Ukrainian front. They are checking for potential individuals capable of executing such an attack. So then, there is a repetition of attacks on Russia. 2 weeks ago, they struck 65 kilometers from Moscow, causing destruction. 105,000 tons of Russian ammunition, including North Korean, were soon to be used on the front. Ukrainians continue to have the ability to strike deep into Russia.
Several foreign leaders will be present at this parade. Does it really make sense from the Ukrainian strategy point of view to get closer, especially to the Americans recently, to disrupt this parade?
But afterwards they wage their war. Russia has only one goal. It's to obtain a 3-day ceasefire to be able to shine, to show its power. The last 2 years it has been a failure, precisely because the Ukrainians have managed to disrupt them or make them give up a number of visits. The Serbian president and Hungarian representatives were initially expected to attend the 9th of May event. Ultimately, both claimed to be ill.
There you have it. The sick were there at the last moment.
Modi was supposed to come. In the end, it's his defense minister. And finally, he just delegated to a deputy. The Belarusian president said he might be late, so it will mainly be the Chinese and Brazilian delegations. But it won't be the radiation that was originally planned. Even if they actually manage to stage a parade with 100,000 men, they can always do it. It won't change anything. But this show of force, if it can be diminished, or if it can cost men and ammunition or equipment that he has to deploy from the Ukrainian front, it's a victory in any case.
Can we hope for a ceasefire? Has Volodymyr Zelensky promised or asked for one? 30 days and the Russians 3.
We believe that a ceasefire is possible at any time, even as early as today.
And it should last at least 30 days for...
Giving diplomacy a real chance.
For example, these past few days they have...
Stated they want a partial ceasefire.
But it should be known that
The number of recent attacks has reached a multi-month high. They have carried out more than 200 attacks. So we do not believe them.
provocations are...
It depends on the Russians. Anyone still believing them should test it.
Xavier Tittleman, do you believe in a ceasefire after the failure of the one on energy infrastructures?
No, Ukraine accepted the ceasefire in March under the conditions proposed by the Americans. Russia refused. Then at Easter, Russia proposed a ceasefire specifically for this Easter holiday. And they are the ones who violated it. The ceasefire is announced, but half an hour later, bombings by planes caused dozens of injuries and some deaths. There, this ceasefire proposal that falls just when it benefits the Russians, obviously it's once again, maybe for once they would respect it because it's to their advantage once again. The Ukrainians propose extending a potential 3-day ceasefire to a 30-day ceasefire. If Russia refuses, Ukraine has the right to reject the ceasefire as it would only benefit the Russians. Since 2014, the Russians have systematically violated all the ceasefires they proposed, including the Minsk agreements. As soon as the ceasefire comes into effect, the Russians attack. In 2015, they took the Donetsk airport. The ceasefires proposed and accepted by the Russians in Ukraine have all been violated for over a decade.
Xavier Tichoman, do you often go to the field?
At the moment, when we look at the armament of the Ukrainians, how much longer can they hold on?
At the current speed, I want to say that there is no limit. The question is not the equipment, the question is our support, which is more economical than material. Today, over half of the weaponry used and encountered by the Ukrainian army daily is produced locally. And they tell me in the factories, if we had more money, we could produce even more. When France managed to produce 8 Caesar cannons per month, they are at 30 equivalent cannons, the Ukrainian Bogdana.
So, wait, what you're saying is very important, and I'd like to emphasize it. You're saying very clearly that the problem isn't the stockpiles of Western countries. In fact, it's just money.
The stocks have already been supplied. We can't go below what has already been given to Ukraine. In all European countries, there is very, very little stock left, except in the United States, which has a plethora of stocks. They could give 2,000 tanks. Just from what they have in reserve, they have given 31. So, the reserve in the United States, it exists. But everything that arrives in Ukraine today, it's production, and it's production. For example, today, we supply more shells to Ukraine than what we had when we were supplying and looking for stocks all over the world.
So you're saying that the excuse no longer holds in fact for some?
If we continue supplying Ukrainians with our production today, they can hold on indefinitely. Our production must increase at the same rate as Russia's. If Russia doubles their efforts in one area, such as missile strikes, we must provide Ukraine with twice as much defense to counter it. But there is no way to have a military collapse of one of the two armies. We need to be clear today. If the balance of power continues to evolve as we see it today, there is suffering on both sides. There is a front that is almost frozen, which is not going to evolve. The Ukrainians are progressing and are now capable of standing up to the Russians. They have consistently led in drones from the start, and their dominance continues to grow. Today they are almost on par in artillery, except that they have artillery that aims much better, so overall it is still to their advantage. They are inferior in aviation, which means that the Russians can continue to bomb and use it as a glide bomb. But the Ukrainians have found a way to jam these glide bombs so they don't fall in the right place. The Russians are redirecting them to cities instead of military sites like trenches. As time goes on, it appears Russia's ability to make progress diminishes. I remind you that in all of 2024, despite losing 400,000 men, they only advanced 4,000 square kilometers, equivalent to a small French department.
However, most diplomatic analyses still suggest that a stop in United States aid would be catastrophic for Ukraine. Look at these words from the former head of the CIA, who says very clearly, we have given Ukraine enough weapons to bleed, not to win. Do you believe in an end to American aid after this agreement on minerals? What are the Ukrainians telling you?
No, in fact, we can even make the opposite observation. Well, the Americans are happy. Trump has declared that there has been a victory. And so a few days later, we see that there is a kind of opening to support the Ukrainians again.
A kind of justification, actually.
It's allowing them to buy equipment. Over $300 million worth of F-16 related equipment can be transferred by the Americans. But $300 million, a plane may cost maybe $50 million. Knowing they won't receive new planes could mean they may have better radars or longer range missiles. So, in the end, this agreement, what it leads to is that American aid is stronger now than since the beginning of Donald Trump's election. That is to say, the flow that was supposed to continue after Biden's departure, it slowed down a bit at one point. And now they are doing almost twice as much.
Why? Because it's a kind of quid pro quo.
I think there's a catching up from that moment when it was a little bit slower. Ukrainians are receiving more aid, evidenced by the increased flow of arriving planes. New equipment, such as these F-16s under a tight top, can be recognized despite attempts to conceal them. We recognize by their shape that these American fighter planes are being delivered directly from the United States to the Polish-Ukrainian border. Just 2 days ago, a deal was signed for equipment worth $350 million. So, yes, very clearly Donald Trump is perhaps finally doing what he promised to do, that is to say, support Ukraine more than it has been in the past, and provide Ukraine with the military means to force Russia to abandon its goal of conquering it.
The war in Ukraine has compelled its allies to reconsider their approach. A parliamentary report has been published on French artillery. Here are the words of the deputies in charge of this report. France does not have sufficient reserves to sustain an intensive artillery effort over the long term. At present, the stocks would last a few weeks at best. For complex ammunition, the manufacturing and delivery times can reach
several months
or even several years. Why don't we have any stock available? Xavier Titelman.
Because we were not unaware of high-intensity warfare, because we were limited to hitting terrorists in the Sahel. With that, having 2 to 3 cannons and 5 to 6 shells per day was sufficient. But now we have French cannons firing in Ukraine, firing more than 100 rounds a day for some. Therefore, we logically had a stock suited for the planned wars. Despite the military's previous statements, in France, for about a decade, we have never even prepared for a possible acceleration. We started doing it in 2022. We are finally seeing results. But Ukraine, which receives millions of European and American shells each year, obviously, that's the reality on the ground for a high-intensity war. If we had to support the Ukrainian front and also need these shells, for example, for a front to defend the Baltic countries. We are not able to supply both and continue to supply Ukraine and to be able to have our own army that would have the equivalent number of goals.
So this is where we need to rethink the model. We've seen it. The army is going to inaugurate its first drone combat arena. This unique and fully secure infrastructure arena will allow for optimal training of instructors and remote pilots, particularly through training with first-person view racer drones. Didier François, who is currently in Kiev, told me that 80% of the front line is defended by drones now in Ukraine. What's the advantage of these drones? Are we also getting into it too late in France?
We are getting into it too late. In 2019, at the Bourget Air Show, first-person view kamikaze drones were already available. In 2017, the Islamic State used first-person view kamikaze drones in Iraq, so this isn't actually new. Those following the case are convinced these systems were necessary. And we started it in an anecdotal way. The Air Force worked with Université de Technologie de Compiègne to occasionally develop small drones called CPA-10. While we didn't mass produce it, the Ukrainians have worked on it since 2014, reaching a colossal level of industrialization today. Over 10,000 kamikaze drones are used daily on the front, in addition to other large drones seen here. We are on a large transport drone with a 88 pounds capacity. 2 weeks ago, I spent a night with drone operators in the trenches just north of Sloviansk in the Donbass. So we, on our side, have not developed this mass. But the interesting thing is, a small kamikaze first-person view drone costs 10 times less than a shell. And it's almost a hit in 3 out of 4 shots.
We can question the effectiveness of artillery in high-intensity battles. Is it complementary? What is this number?
An artillery shell contains 30 to 40 kilos of explosives, while a first-person view kamikaze drone carries 2 kilos. So, when you target individual men or lightly protected vehicles, you can use FPVs 100%. On the other hand, your artillery, it's going to be in fixed positions, bunkers. We discovered these Russian kamikaze drones originate from a small buried bunker. Placing 2 or 3 shells on the same bunker will obviously destroy it, which can't be done with first-person view kamikaze drones. So there's really a complementarity of the two. The second element involves observation using the drones seen here, which are observation drones. With the LFX, which will be able to fly up to about 20 hours, these observation drones, they will see the Russian offensives that are going to prepare half an hour in advance, generally, in any case, that's what they tell me. And at that moment, when the Russians arrive, we send them FPVs, we send them artillery. And if they ever manage to get past those 2 barriers, it's the men in the trenches who will have to finish the job with rifles. But so, we really have this complementarity. The goal is to prevent the zero line, the men holding the front line, from confronting the Russians by stopping them with the FPVs.
We continue to innovate in artillery, with notably the Foudre, this French multiple rocket launcher that surprisingly competes with the American HIMARS. How does this announcement bring France into a new dimension? Xavier Dittelman.
So we have the unitary rocket launchers, the line replaceable unit, which are nearing the end of their life, so it's planned that we have a successor. And there were already two historic companies that have positioned themselves. Thales Safran, the big MBDA, was already planned. Surprisingly, it's a company. We are becoming accustomed to being surprised by the company called Turgis and Gaillard. For instance, 2 years ago at the Bourget Air Show, they unveiled a combat drone slightly larger than the Bayraktar. For instance, the renowned Bayraktar that succeeded early in Ukraine. And now they are offering us this system. So we would have a third competitor, internal development on our own funds, which will allow us to have the equivalent of the high mobility artillery rocket system or the French line replaceable unit, but it will hit twice as far, 160 kilometers, with even bigger missiles up to 500 to 700 kilometers range. And it's simply to have a rebalancing with what the Russians are developing and what the Russians are using, and also what we've seen of the effectiveness. We must remember the victory of Kherson in 2022. It's because the Ukrainians have faced these systems. This led to the collapse of Russian logistics, resulting in the city's liberation.
Another weapon that makes the Ukrainians dream, and not only since the Americans live it, since they call this weapon the wonder weapon. Safran's high-precision, modular air-to-ground weapon, Armement Air Sol Modulaire, this time a large French arms company. What is its specificity? Why is it so envied?
So the A2SM, it's a smooth bomb, so the simplest bombs, what we call half bombs, so the dumb bombs. But on which ones? We're going to add wings that allow it instead of doing a vertical. It falls in a bell-shaped pattern and can glide up to 6043.496 miles in range. And then we can put small boosters at the back to make them even more efficient. And then on the front, we see that here there is a head, but in fact this head, it can be a head with an optic that will allow to recognize either a vehicle, even a moving vehicle, because you have these little wings that allow for movement. A vehicle moving at 6043 miles each, it can follow it. Here we see the different heads. We have global positioning systems, but the global positioning system is jammed, and its American equivalent relies much more on the global positioning system. Logically, there are far more areas in Ukrainian territory where they can't use it. And so this system, it is supplied at a rate of 1,000 units per year to Ukraine. About 60 units are produced each month, 2 per day. The bombs will evolve significantly, weighing between 250 and 1,123.1 pounds. I was a mission planner on Rafale, and one of my jobs at the time was to configure the trajectory of these bombs. And what's interesting is that we can also make sure to avoid collateral damage. I want to target something that is here. It's very high precision. If I want to target something that is here, but there is, for example, a school behind it, I can make my bomb follow a trajectory and come back to hit in that direction, to hit towards a field so that any potential debris ends up in a field. And that absolutely does not exist on the Russian side. And it's effective. There is no weapon today that is equivalent to that one, even in the United States.
Thank you, Xavier Teitelman. It was fascinating as usual.